And we're back with David Kennedy talking about grief. So David, in this segment, I would love to ask you the question. We talked about in the previous segments, what is grief? What is normal about grief? What are there different types of grief?
So they have identified different types of grief, for lack of a better term, only because it leads to the ability of people to get what they need in order to deal with grief. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, when people experience a very overwhelming grief, somebody very close, death of a child, there's, as you know, our culture gives people a 3-day bereavement period from work. They may extend that to a full week if you're fortunate. But we all know that nobody can go back to work after a death of a child in 7 days. So they introduce terms that allow for certain mourning opportunities, things like complicated grief, things like disenfranchised grief. There's ways in which we describe the grief that can be helpful. Now, it can also have the other side to it, so that, again, if we label something, then people start to have this idea that, okay, there's something wrong with me. And that's where, I'm very careful around using the labels. So people talk about frozen grief, or getting stuck in grief. I've heard that one. Again, those are judgment calls that are basically saying, well, you're not moving to this point fast enough. So again, it's about that judgment of time. How fast are you able to do this? And again, it's I tell people, it's not about recovery. I don't like the word recovery. We don't go back to who we were. We have to find out who we are now. One of the ways grief changes us is in our identity. Who am I now? Especially if that person who has died was a spouse or a parent or a child, then we have huge identity questions that we have to wrestle with. And they can take a long time. So if all of a sudden somebody comes along and says, well, that you're stuck in grief because you're still back here trying to deal with this, it just adds another heavy layer on you of expectation. And you're saying, well, I guess I'm not doing this well. I guess I'm not doing this right. And so you put more pressure on yourself to try to be something you can't be. So when we talk about these different categories of grief, I think they can be helpful in allowing people to see that, okay, this is where I am and what's happening, as long as we can help them to also say, and it's okay. It doesn't mean there's something wrong. Complicated grief is a grief that what we're saying is doesn't follow a normal trajectory of, okay, I can do this and it's off. But it's a complication based in the relationship or on the way in which the person died. I think of, for instance, homicides or suicides, where the death comes with all kinds of pieces to it. We can say, yeah, that makes it a complicated death, a complicated grief. But it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you.
So coming back to your previous thought that we talked about in our previous sessions about the 3 different types, the terms that you used, the bereavement, the grief, and the mourning. So when you are listening to someone share their grief story, is there a conversation in your head that's taking place that this is the complicated grief, or this is the cumulative grief or disfranchised grief? Are there signs that you are reading that gives you that understanding?
So there are a couple of things. That's a great question. What am I looking for? Well, I'm looking for how is this person able to find what they need to deal with what they need? Do they have support to be able to deal with that? Are they at a point in their grief where they are simply floundering and not knowing what to do? Are they self-judging? And are they putting expectations on themselves? In terms of the complicated grief, that looks at it from a couple of points of view. First of all, for me, there are certain types of death that in my experience, I start with a complicated grief position. So the death of a child, I just start with, this is complicated grief. This is not, you're not going to deal with this in 6 months. You know, we are looking at years. And the truth is, with all grief, we get back to the time, you're never over it. There is no such thing as closure to grief.
And yet there is an expectation we have to just go through this process and we'll come on the other end being normal, which we touched a little bit earlier. But what you were saying is it's not something you get over, it's something that you actually go through and are transformed.
And we have to find that journey, and that's a hard one. So what gets complicated is how overwhelming that grief is. And when it involves a child, I think that's we can understand that. But it's also there with certain types of death, so homicide and suicide. The homicide, it's there because of the process, the judicial process, so that can go on for years. So all of that thing affects it. By the way, the number one cause of death in young adults, 18 to 25, in Canada, is homicide.
Oh wow!
Now we are shocked by that, but what is the news? What do you hear in this city, in Toronto? And so, I'm saying that homicide is one of those griefs that's automatically, for me, a complicated grief. But so is suicide. So is the death of a child. So there are certain deaths that I start with, and I just begin from a complicated position. But there are other grief that can be complicated because the relationship is complicated. So for instance, and it doesn't mean that it has to be negative or toxic. We talk about an enmeshment. So sometimes relationships are enmeshed. And what that means is that they're so enmeshed that it's wonderful when they're alive, but it creates some problems if one of those people die. So for instance, I had a couple who were in their 50s, late 50s. They worked at the same facility. They had different jobs, but they worked at the same facility. And they 24/7 they were together. They were never apart. And they were like that for 30 years, 35 years in their marriage. He told me they had never been apart one night in 35 years. They lived every day together. They did the groceries together. And that's wonderful. I think, they had a great life. But when she died of an aneurysm, suddenly, that enmeshment just broke. And so that was a complicated grief that came out of, a really great life for them. They loved their life. But that enmeshment that they chose to live has implications in grief later on. So even good relationships can get complicated, is my point. So we're not looking at just negative stuff here. It's just, so I don't know. I need to listen and hear that. So what I'm listening for are things that telling me, okay, this is going to be challenging here, or here's some pieces that are part of this story that we need to work on that are not going to just go away in a few weeks. So, but and again, I come back to that doesn't make it bad, and that doesn't make it wrong. It's just different, and we have to deal with it differently.
So when you use two examples, the complicated grief because the couple had been staying together for so long and their relationship was so
Enmeshed.
unique in that enmeshed is the term you use. When, as a friend, if you're witnessing one of your friends or family members experience that and you want to comfort them, I think the tendency that we have is to fix their grief or take away their pain.
Right.
But how would you advise us to approach our family members or friends who are going through that complicated grief or who express that the first time the news of that loss?
Right. And that this is where it gets it's very challenging to support people. Where I begin with is I would say to the friend, I would say, so how long are you prepared to do this? How long are you prepared to listen, to sit with them, to allow them to tell you the story? How long are you prepared to allow them to just cry without trying to say, please don't cry? And then I would say, whatever they told me, if they said, oh, I think 6 months, I would say to them, triple everything that you're telling me. So instead of 6 months, move it out to 18 months before you even question it. So the point I'm saying is just people who try to support people in that have a very short timeline. And I need them to say, no, it's not my timeline here, it's their timeline. When they are ready to do the next piece, they're ready, not when I think. Now, that doesn't mean I can't support them in that journey. And I can keep saying to them, how are you today and again, even that question, how are you? You notice I didn't say, how are you? How are you today? And when I ask you how you are today, we can gauge that. Well, I'm better today than I was yesterday. Or I feel like I'm worse today than I was yesterday. So just choosing those questions instead of saying, well, how's it going? Or how are you? No, be specific, but also don't be specific in a way that pushes people. Allow them to respond to how they are today.
That word today alone just it liberates you, because then it's almost like frees you from the expectations.
Right.
You are just free to tell how you are today.
Today. I don't have to worry about this piece. I can tell you how I'm feeling right now. Or I can even say, how are you right in this moment? What's it like right now for you? So in other words, being more specific about that.
So when we put timeline or expectations on our family and friends who are grieving, we're actually adding to their grief.
Big time. Yeah, and that's what we don't want to do. And most of those expectations that we're putting on them are for our sake, not for them. So, I'm worried that you're never going to change. I'm worried that you're not going to get any better. I'm worried that you're always going to cry. But that is more about me than it is them. So I need you to be okay. I need you to be better. I need to see you get better quickly so that if it ever happens to me, I'll know I can be better. It's hard to sit with people. So the imagery that I use in supporting people in grief is being able to sit with them in grief. In the Bible, the picture that we are given in the Old Testament is about people sitting in sackcloth and ashes. And, you picture Job, who sat in sackcloth and ashes. That's grief. That's the picture.
A very public expression of grief.
Public expression.
So you're not just keeping it internal, you're expressing that I'm in grief.
Right.
So that's a mourning piece.
Right. It's a mourning piece of our grief, exactly. We're mourning the grief. And what you notice that Job's 3 friends all tried to get him out of it.
Yes.
What he needed was simply his friends to sit with him. So when somebody says, how do I support my friend in grief? I will say just that. Sit with them. Don't talk.
Sit with them.
I call it witnessing. Be a witness. Alan Wolfelt, who's a very prolific writer in grief, he talks about companioning. He talks about being a companion in grief, which is a great concept. So companion, being a witness, being a true friend is not someone who's always telling you what you need to be doing, but somebody who's willing to sit with you, you will come out. Believe me, you will get up. I can't tell whether it's today or tomorrow. You will change. But a real friend is somebody who will allow you to be what you need to be, unless it's creating problems. Not for me, but for them.
So it's the piece of function. Are they able to function?
Right.
And I think that would be a concerning point that we could consider as a red flag.
Right. And rather than trying to get them to function, how do we support them so that they get what they need until they're ready to be able to do it themselves? So, yeah, and so one of the big things, people, if they live alone and they're older, they may not eat. They may not, especially if it's a spouse who died, that all of a sudden, how do I cook for myself? How do I do that? I don't feel like it. I don't want to. And it doesn't take long if you're not eating properly and drinking, hydrating, that physically you're going to be in trouble. So if you're supporting somebody and you're noticing they're not eating, it's probably not good to say to them, oh, you need to eat, you need to do this. It's probably better for you to say, is it okay if I bring over some food today? Or and not asking them to come to your place because they may not be willing to do that. But can I drop off some food for you? So at first, if that goes on for years, then we're into some other issues. But even for 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It's, okay, I need to support you right now. This is what you need in order to be functioning.
So maybe the question we can ask them is, how can I help?
And that's true. I would much rather you observe how you could help, because my guess is people will say back to you, I'm okay. I don't need your help. Because most of us want to be independent. Most of us, in grief, if it's real grief, we may not want people around like that. So I'm always encouraging people to say things like, would it be okay if I brought over some food for you? Would it be okay if I came and we went for a walk in the morning for 15 minutes? Would it be okay if I just came and cleaned your house once a week? So I think proactively, but never just saying I'm doing it, giving them the option is something. But if they're seeing, for instance, if you're seeing them not eating, and you realize it's getting to be a health issue, then I would say it's time for you to say, I'm going to bring over some food and I'll just drop it off for you and you can eat it when you're ready. So it's one of those things that we have to gauge and be willing to adjust. But again, put yourself I'm not doing this for me, I'm doing this for you. What is it you need? Not what I think you need. Because I don't know. I don't know what you need.
So it's sitting with them mindfully.
Mindfully. What a great word.
Thank you, David, for sharing that wisdom with us. We would connect back on some more issues on our next segment.